traditionally raucous night owls, and we've got a great day scheduled for you today. A couple housekeeping notes before we get started. First, as those of you who were at the dinner last night heard, the Beaux-Arts has very generously given us all lifetime passes to their facility, and those are available to you out at the front desk. Secondly, I encourage everyone here to check the BF app for updates in our schedule. And now, without further ado, what I'd like to do is turn it over to our friend Bruce Stokes from the Pew Research Center, who has looked deeply into what we all think. Yesterday we heard about populism and elitism, what to do about changing economy, technology, the future of American power, the future of the EU. Well, before this conference, we asked all of you some questions about these topics. And Bruce has looked into this, and he will walk through the results with you. And he's joined by Richard Lee of MSNBC News. Thanks, and have a great day.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Were the night owl sessions good? And the morning session even better. Bruce, good to have you here to discuss all the data that was, Derek just gave us a good overview. Who participated in this survey? If you can just quick hands in the air. Okay, we've got about 10%. That's about right.
Yeah,
is that right, Bruce?
We had an 18% return.
So Bruce is a director of global economic attitudes at Pew Research Center. Even better, 25-year journalist at the National Journal, a journal that I very much have read over the years. So Bruce, you are going to kick us off with a question. Very appropriate being from Pew.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. And welcome, everybody, and thank to all of you who participated in the survey. This survey of transatlantic thought leaders, we thought we would try to get a sense of how people who are deeply engaged in transatlantic issues think about some of these challenges we face. And we are in the process of asking European publics and North American publics the same exact questions. So we will eventually be able to compare public opinion with thought leader opinion. But today I wanted to share with you the thought leader results. Just to give you briefly a sense of this, we did this online, and there were 3,218 people who we queried. 538 of you responded. That doesn't sound good, but that's an 18% return, and I can tell you on these kind of surveys, that's phenomenal. So thank you all for participating. What we would like to do, we asked people an open-ended question. We said, you can tell us whatever you want. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the transatlantic relationship over the next 12 months? And we got a lot of different answers. We tried to narrow it down, code it, so we could get some sense of priorities. And we're going to ask you to see what you think of the main things that people told us. So if we could put these questions up and get out your apps so we can do the question. Could somebody bring up the questions on the screen? There we go. These were the top 5 responses in that open-ended question. So I want to ask all of you to go to your apps and vote over the next 30 seconds in terms of what you think of those 5 is the single most important challenge facing the transatlantic relationship over the next 12 months. And what we will do then is I will tell you how you picked versus how the broader set of respondents chose.
Bruce, as they're doing that, maybe you can give us a little bit more detail on how you went about the survey.
Yeah, what we did is we took the invitee list for the Brussels Forum. We also queried people who had participated in various German Marshall Fund Fellows programs, primarily the Marshall Memorial's Fellows program. So we had a very broad group of people of all ages. I can tell you the most prominent age group was 40 to 45, so it is, not a bunch of old fogies like me.
Oh, come on, Bruce, you're not that old.
But the reality is. So I think our time is up. Let's see what people said.
Well,
I can tell you that your responses compare exactly with, correct, the same response as the general survey population.
And you have a drill down on number 3,
we have drill downs on this, and we'll share with you. But basically, the broader audience said it was Trump. President Trump was the biggest challenge, followed by a decline in trust and values.
Very interesting. Let's get to the first slide, because you have 6 different major questions that you asked. Let's get to the first one.
The first slide was
on greatest threats.
Yes, we asked people. No, I should go back here. Yeah, we asked people. We gave them, this was not a volunteered list, we said, of these threats to your country, what do you think are the greatest threats that your country now faces? Among this thought leader group of 538, people said climate change was the biggest threat facing their country today. Second were cyber attacks. 25% of you said it was U.S., so we could maybe talk about that later. But what was interesting in this case was that there were some statistically significant differences between European respondents and American respondents in this survey. Basically, Americans were more worried about cyber attacks, about climate. American thought leaders were more worried about climate change, which you might wonder whether you would have expected that. We Americans are more worried about China, but Europeans are more worried about refugees.
Bruce, just for folks, if you pull out your app, as we go along, please go back in. And what is surprising to you about the data that was pulled from this group of decision makers and thought leaders in the transatlantic conversation?
Yeah.
Just to go back to your first slide, though.
Yeah,
at the bottom there, very quickly here, if you go back, and that is
there we go.
The results. China's power and influence, large number of refugees leaving. U.S. power and influence does not seem to synchronize, at least with the initial question that was asked of this group. For instance, U.S. power and influence.
I'll tell you, when you ask a question in a survey, you don't know what the respondent was thinking when you asked the question. We have asked this question, for example, every year of publics around the world. Last year in Japan, for example, a majority of the public said that U.S. power and influence was a major threat to Japan. Now, what in the world did that mean? Did they mean that we were a threat, or was it the decline of American power was the threat? We don't know. So one of the things we're going to be doing, I think, over the next day and a half is talking about what you as respondents may have meant by some of these things.
Right. Go to the next slide, because the differentials between cyber attacks from other countries and China's power and influence, we're seeing 20+ percentage points difference. Any quick headline out of that?
Well, certainly on China, we know in terms of public opinion in the past that Americans are much more worried about China than Europeans have been. Especially in terms of the military threat posed by China, maybe arguably so, because we are more engaged in the Pacific than are the Europeans. And we also know that Americans are very worried about Chinese economic challenges. European publics less so, although that tends to be growing in the public opinion survey.
Great. So, next slide.
We asked people, what do you think, over the next 12 months, do you think that relations between Europe and the United States are get better or worse or stay about the same? We ask it 3 different ways because we realized people could have different views based on different aspects of the relationship. But in each case, overwhelmingly, people said, we think that the relationship is going to get worse. In security matters, diplomatic matters, economic issues. These are pretty strong majorities in all cases.
Pessimism.
Pessimism about the future of the relationship, at least in the short run. There are some differences on some of these issues, not particularly on this one, but there are some demographic issues on some of these we can get into in terms of men versus women and so on. But when you get numbers like this, you tend to not have any demographic differences simply because it's so strong in one direction.
Did that surprise you? Because it's pretty much 3/4, 2/3.
Right. Frankly, I didn't know how this would work out. I mean, we knew from the other questions that people were worried. And this is just to kind of flesh out a little bit why they meant they were worried.
This is the stew, if you will.
Now, we ask a specific question we've asked the publics before, which is, if Russia gets in a serious military conflict with one of its neighboring countries that's a NATO ally, do you think that the U.S. would use its military force to help defend that country? Basically, the thought leaders in this survey are divided on that issue. 49% said yes, the U.S. would. 46% said no, the U.S. wouldn't. notice that Americans and Europeans feel about the same way. Europeans are a little bit more likely to say that the U.S. would come to a European NATO ally's defense, but there's really not a huge difference there. It is interesting that women in our survey, who make up 39% of the survey sample, and younger people are the least likely to think that the U.S. would actually follow through in its title.
Why?
Its Article 5 commitment. Again, we don't know. I mean, it's interesting. We do know what's happened in the last year.
Right.
That President Trump, during the campaign, raised questions about U.S. commitment to NATO. Is that what we're seeing here? We just don't know. We also know that when we asked the publics in NATO countries this question in 2015, what we found was that the public in America, 56%, said, oh, we would go to our NATO allies' defense. In individual European NATO countries, there was not that commitment.
So what you're saying are younger thought leaders are more hopeful or more open to the potentiality of all of this being possible as opposed to it being negative?
Well, actually, and this result is that no, between 18 to 44-year-olds say no, the U.S. will not come to our defense.
Right. Interesting.
Overall, in the public survey in 2015, Europeans said no, we expect the Americans to come to our defense. The interesting thing in that survey was the Germans said they wouldn't go to other people's defense. The French and the Italians said they wouldn't go to other people's defense.
Okay, the slide everybody's been waiting for.
Yeah, we asked people, do you have confidence in various leaders to do the right thing in international affairs? As you can see, people overwhelmingly in our survey said that they have confidence in German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Only 39% had confidence in Vladimir Putin. Only 13% had confidence in U.S. President Trump, and 10% in Chinese President Xi. So by 3 to 1 in this survey sample, thought leaders had more confidence in President Putin than they did in Donald Trump.
So this is the slide that everyone's going to tweet.
It's up to you. We then ask about various characteristics, personality characteristics.
Bruce, I don't know if you're going back to the other slide.
Yeah.
When President Xi spoke at Davos, it almost seemed that this number would not be there.
Well, that certainly made a great deal of publicity.
Right.
As you may recall, President Xi spoke at Davos and put himself forward, and China put forward as the defender of globalization, the defender of the global order. And it was interpreted, at least by the press at that point, as he was saying, if the Americans are not going to lead, we're going to lead.
Right.
It would appear from these results that the transatlantic thought leaders, it didn't affect their opinion of the Chinese president.
Interesting. Thank you.
We ask about personality characteristics of the new U.S. president. We do this every 8 years. When we do our public survey, we ask about various personality characteristics. In this survey, as you can see, 94% of the people in the survey said they thought that President Trump was arrogant. 88% said he was intolerant. 85% said he was dangerous. Only 6% thought he was well qualified to be president. You ask people a question, they give you an answer, and we have to assume that's what they think. But that is the results of this survey. I want to thank you all for participating. We will, in the fall, be releasing a report that will compare the thought leader survey to the public opinion survey in those same countries with these same questions, which could be a very interesting thing to look at. All of this material, by the way, is going to be available on the website, the GMF website, and the Pew Research Center website. And bear in mind, this is an experiment. We're trying to figure out how to assess thought leader opinion, and we think this is a great opening opportunity. I want to thank GMF.
So, Bruce, we got 2 minutes here. You saw the opening yesterday.
Yeah.
Laid the foundation of the discussion of populism, of the working class voice. What did you find in this? How will you use this data of thought leaders, of decision makers, and input into that very question that has started us off here at Brussels Forum?
That's a great question. We will be asking in the public opinion survey that's now going on in your countries a number of questions that relate to populist topics, such as how do you feel about the economy? Do you think your kids are going to be better off than you are? one of the questions we actually asked thought leaders that we didn't put up here because it didn't fit in the narrative at this point, we asked people how they, and we're asking the public this as well, how do they want their democracy to function going forward? Do they want continued representative democracy? Would they like the public to vote directly on more issues? Would they like experts to lead on more issues? Would they like a strong leader, et cetera? That, I think, will also get us some popular sentiment.
And then finally, the word cloud, which everybody has been inputting. What are your thoughts here about what is surprising folks here in this room and those who are watching in terms of other decision makers and thought leaders?
So it would appear Transatlantic is the issue that is most...
Climate is in there as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, very good.
Good, thank you.
So we have set something for the day, some
Thanks.
data for folks to look
Appreciate
at.
it.
Thank you all for your attention. And again, Bruce told us where you can find the data as the day goes on. Thank you again, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Trade and innovation have lifted millions out of poverty in the last century. Standards of living have risen around the world. But the benefits of an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world have not been shared by all. The impacts of this, both real and perceived unfairness, have eroded public trust in our institutions. Governments, courts, media, business, international organizations. Public faith in the pillars of society has vanished. We are in an age of backlash. Brexit, canceled trade deals, border walls, fake news, populism, nationalism. Will nations back away from globalism, or will faith in international cooperation be restored? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome European correspondent and Brussels bureau chief of Deutsche Welle, Mr. Max Hoffman.
Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you had good night owl sessions and everybody's back on board this morning. Does the world want to be connected? We're going to talk about the mainly economic issue, and that means we're going to talk a lot about free trade this morning. So I just wanted to know, is anybody from the region of Wallonia in the room? No? That's good. I was afraid that we're going to block the panel today. Okay, so I came back from the G20 finance ministers meeting last Friday and Saturday in Baden-Baden. And for the first time, I think in the history of the G20, they failed to agree to endorse free trade in the final communique. Now, the German finance minister said that's not a big deal. It doesn't really mean anything. But if you look at what's happened in the last year, it kind of seems like a big deal. Because, of course, we had the election of Donald Trump, TPP, TTIP got scrapped, then globalization played a huge role during Brexit in the UK, and then, as I just mentioned, CETA barely made it because of the resistance, and I must add, not only the resistance, of course, of a tiny region in Belgium, Wallonia, but of course, there's resistance everywhere in Europe to free trade, especially also in Germany, and the Germans in the room know that. So at the same time, we want to be more connected digitally. Everybody wants to have access to everything. And then there's this resistance. It's hard to comprehend. This is a very complicated world. And trying to make sense of it, we have our three panelists here today, which I would like you to welcome with a little applause first. From the European Parliament, we have Marietje Schaake, who is, what you say, progressive liberal, so definitely here on the side of free trade, which is going to be a big part, of course, of the discussion. The man who made, well, I think the longest trip here today is Michael Stumo. And I asked our intern, just for training purposes, how would you introduce Michael? So he comes back 2 hours later and he says, all right, so he's a Trump lobbyist. And I told him that's not entirely what he is. He works for a think tank, which is bipartisan, I must add, which is, of course, the Coalition for a Prosperous America. But it is true, I think, Michael. It's safe to say that you, of all here on our panel, are the one who's most understanding of what the Trump administration is planning in the sense of trade. And then, as our third panelist over here, we have Ian Khan. He's not the bad guy here, but he's big business if you talk about free trade. And of course, big business is one of the boogeymen for many people who are against free trade. He works for Centrica, which is, I think it's fair to say, an energy giant, especially in the UK, but also active in North America. So, this is a great panel, and I would like to start, first of all, with you, before we do that. We have a word cloud. You can use it on your app. I would like you just to choose one word that you associate or that just comes to mind when it comes to free trade. What's the one word you think about? And we'll look at the result later. But first, we'll start with all our panelists giving a very short remark on what they think needs to be done in this world where we're not sure anymore if it wants to be connected or not. Maricha, why don't you start?
So good morning, everybody. Does the world want to be more connected? Do people want to be more connected? My answer is yes. And it's not my thought about it, but think about the clothes you're wearing today. Where were they made? The device you're using to app or put words into the word cloud. The rare earth minerals in there are an essential ingredient that isn't found in Europe, for example. So we actually need to be connected. We need access to resources elsewhere. Production processes are increasingly integrated. And that is indeed a reason why so many hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty. On the other hand, of course, you see in developing countries that small, medium-sized enterprises, farmers, almost everybody around the world is interested in gaining access to markets like ours here in Europe, because we're a wealthy set of consumers, and it is a great benefit for these people to sell their products here. Similarly, our businesses, small, large ones, must look at where economic growth is going to take place over the next decades. And it's not going to be in Europe for the largest part. 90% approximately of global economic growth is going to be taking place outside of Europe. So it's also in our interest to get access to these growing markets, and the lifting out of poverty, growing middle classes in developing countries is therefore in our direct interest too. But what many people fear, and I think that is reason for the tension in the discussion, is that this globalization, looking for new markets, looking for other production chains and methods, is going to unchain a race to the bottom. That big companies are always going to find the cheapest prices, the cheapest labor, and that many, many people are left behind. And this is not what we need. We should actually avoid a race to the bottom, because that is not beneficial for everyone. It's going to erode trust in our own societies. We see that that's a reason for more nationalism, populism perhaps, concern among people, increasing of middle classes. So what I think is the solution is to look at how we can use trade rules. And I don't like to talk about free trade, because free trade seems like it's a free-for-all, survival of the fittest, no rules, just limitless competition. I think instead we need a rules-based trade that takes into account the interests but also values that we cherish, and it should take a global perspective. And I think we've been successful in that. The kinds of trade agreements, the rules that we set around globalization today are not the same as we did a couple of decades ago. They do take into consideration the values that we cherish more and more, whether we look at CETA, that's quite progressive, or whether we look at rules that stop, for example, the trade in conflict minerals, that really should stop conflict areas being impacted by the minerals that we need if there are not rules. So I think it can be done, stopping a race to the bottom by having values-based trade, and that is what I think is the solution as well.
And we'll talk about what exactly those values are later, but now it's your turn, Michael.
Thank you. So income insecurity gave rise to the Trump administration, and we'll go into that a little bit more. The issue of free trade, I think free trade is not a good analogy. I think it conceals more than it reveals. The issue is balanced trade versus imbalance. And we'll talk about that further. But when I was invited here, I thought, why are they inviting me? I'll be the skunk at the picnic. I'll be an irritant. I found out yesterday, because I'm sort of an economic populist, not an authoritarian populist, not a white nationalist, but sort of an economic populist a little bit. But I found out populists are a threat, so I guess I'm a threat. You can decide later if I'm a threat. But my organization has agriculture, farmers and ranchers in the US. We have manufacturers, usually small and medium-sized, tooling, machining companies and the like. We have organized labor. We have a wide spectrum from Republicans to Democrats, very committed Republicans and Democrats. We have people that donated very heavily to Hillary Clinton. AFL-CIO, which is a big American union, is in our group. We have Dan D'Amico, who was on the Trump trade transition team, and very interesting board meetings before the election. But trade doesn't cut cleanly down party lines in the US. But if you went in the primaries, you know, Trump was the joke candidate, reality star. But if you were in Ohio or in the Midwest, you go to a Jeb Bush rally, who's the brother of the former president, and there's 400 people. You see a Trump rally, and there's 10,000, right? Something's going on here. The forgotten man, trade and jobs. You may hear different things through the Financial Times, through the European press, through the New York Times, but what people heard there, I'm from Iowa, I'm from a hog farm, originally. And so people are concerned. There's a lot of income insecurity. I was in DC last week with our group. We met with the White House, Peter Navarro, the head of the National Trade Council. We had about 100 meetings with Congress. Washington is trying to keep up because the voters are changing faster than Congress is, and they don't know what's what. The BBC called me the day after the election and said, you must be pretty happy Trump won. Well, I said, half our members are on antidepressants. Half of them are on painkillers because they've been partying all night. One of my board members said, you know, this is the happiest I've been since we got out of the Vietnam War. I mean, it's a very diverse group. But on the trade issues, we're concerned, and it's balance. So we have balance, I think, should be the focus. The IMF Article 1 talks about the expansion and balance of trade. The EU Treaty, Article 2, talks about balanced development. We have a lot of imbalances, persistent imbalances through new mercantilism that's going on in the world that many are trying to paper over. From our group's view, the establishment, the elite, are trying to paper over the currency manipulation, massive subsidies of state-owned entities in some of the Asian countries. From our perspective, we're the consumer of last resort. We can no longer, our middle class can't finance the growth of 3.5 billion people around the world. And so how do we manage that when all those people are coming online, 3.5 billion from China, India, Indonesia, producing more than they consume and rely on the US market to get wealthy? So the balance is the key, I think.
And I think we're going to hear a lot more about balance later as well. Now it's up to Ian Kahn from Centrica.
Well, good morning, everyone. Well, does the world want to be connected? It's a very big question, and the world's a big place. My answer is yes, people do want to be connected, but increasingly only on their terms. For most of the world, especially developing economies, this is essential. Connectivity is essential for growth and prosperity. The doubts are emerging in the established economies. Let me illustrate this in 4 ways, briefly. Firstly, globalization and inequality, which both of you have referred to. On average, globalization has been very good for the world. It's pulled 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 25 years. In Middle America, however, there's been no real wage increases for 30 years. And there's a growing fear of immigration, so we've got very demanding consumers and voters. The institutional framework is not trusted, and actually, rather than not being connected, I hear people now saying they want to be disentangled. People want to be connected only on their terms. Second way of looking at this is technology acceleration. People want the huge convenience and efficiency by leveraging global technology development, but the pace of change this time does not easily allow for reskilling in a timely way. And for the first time, I'd argue, new activities may not replace old ones. People fear this and are wondering how connected they want to be as a result. Again, they want to be connected, but only on their terms. Brexit, the third way of looking at this, was the canary in the coal mine, I think. It wasn't about the EU. It was about the issues of globalization, inequality, and immigration, as much as it was a vote about the EU. Again, people in the UK want to be connected, but only on their terms. And I know this is the second part of the debate, but on ideas, ideas are being followed, but they're not being contained by the institutional framework that we're used to anymore, and they don't have to be fact-based, it seems. People like being connected, and they'll follow ideas, but again, on their terms. So what do we do, finally? Three things I would suggest. We need to listen and respond. We've got to address the concerns that are emerging. We must be sensitive to local and sub-regional issues. We've got to have industrial strategies. We've got to drive hard on competitiveness and productivity to win jobs. The big issue is that can conflict with free trade. Thinking long-term and continuing with major international themes. Some of them are easier: security, defense, and intelligence. Cooperation is relatively straightforward. Trying to maintain a momentum on climate change and energy policy, much more difficult in this current context. And we've got to maintain global diplomatic relations. And the third and final thing I'd say we need to do is we need to ensure that old alliances do not get pulled apart as we become more and more inwardly focused. We've got to work on the common ground we have. So people want to be connected, but on their terms. And I would put it to you, the real challenge and response is actually about quality leadership, and it's in short supply.
Thank you very much to our three panelists. And we have the results of our word cloud. I'm sure you've seen it before. It seems to be more on the positive side. So the biggest is prosperity. We have opportunity, growth, integrity. But we also had, and I saw that earlier, oppression, unequal, advantages, asymmetric. So I think we really have all the words that were part of the discussion last year. I would like to have a very... I'm sorry?
I'm so relieved there's no chlorine chicken in there.
I was going to talk to you about that right now. First question to you. There's a lot of boogeymen when it comes to free trade and being connected, globalization. And one in Germany especially was chlorine chicken coming from the United States. That was if you were against free trade, it was a fantastic symbol to combat it. Now you talk about values. Mm-hmm. How are you going to set these values, and what kind of values against the chlorine chicken?
Well, it's up to the Americans if they want to eat chlorine chicken, but in Europe we've decided that that is not the way we clean dead animals before consumption. So
but we do agree that it's a minor part in a huge...
Well, it is, but basically the misunderstanding arises when people think that trade negotiations lead to meeting in the middle. So to watering down principles that one side has or laws that one side has. And that is not the case. So we are still, if we take this example of the chlorine chicken, free in Europe to say, look, this is not the kind of cleaning procedure or rule that we would accept. So this difference will remain, even if we're trying to make it more easy, lower tariffs, simplify the procedures of applying for licenses or other kinds of contracts that you need to export, qualifications, etc.
And how can you use that? I mean, how can you use that to your advantage? Because you talk about the values. What are those values?
Values are environmental protection, labor rights, consumer safety. I mean, you don't want to import products that are poisonous, for example, and this is a real issue. If you look at the amount of products that are taken out of border checks that are coming from China, for example, you need to make sure that what you import is actually safe. So those are the kinds of standards that we want to be high and we want to bake into these trade agreements. But of course, also things like child labor or the production standards under which we see mining or other kinds of production. we want to make sure that the EU sets high standards and also asks those high standards when we import.
By the way, feel free, if you want to ask a question, just let me know. We're not going to wait for later. Do you have a question on that specific topic? No, okay. If you have a question on what we are talking about right now, always let me know. We'll have time for other questions later.
Could
Sure.
I follow up on that? Yeah. So the free trade
By the way,
agreement.
feel free, you know, if you want to stretch
So
your
the
legs
free
or
trade
something.
agreements have been, I'm on the quantitative reciprocity, but on the values and all that, in my organization, we've been critical of the free trade agreements that have watered down standards, that have made trade the preeminent value over food safety, over labor rights, over environmental rights, and trade's number one. Everything else has to fall. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we worked very hard against, and we're very happy when Mr. Trump pulled out, President Trump, purported to further erode a lot of those values. So in the U.S., we have an issue of Brazilian beef coming in. It's been kept out a lot of years for foot and mouth disease and blue tongue and that sort of thing, and it's very, it spreads through the herd quite a bit. And our Department of Agriculture released a memo or a press release saying, we now are allowing, we're liberalizing trade with Brazil and beef. The U.S. beef herd is about the lowest since it's been since 1951, so it's on the decline. There's some of my members and said, we're going to have great export opportunities for Brazilian beef. Brazil has 100 million people. They have 200 million cattle. They can't eat all that beef, but it's promoted as free trade, and the food safety and the animal health kind of takes a second fiddle. So I don't purport to want to send chlorine-cleaned chicken to the EU.
No, that's okay, but can I ask another question? Because you talked a lot about the middle classes in the Rust Belt. I went to college in Ohio for a year, so I've spent some time there.
We like to call it the industrial states.
Okay, well, the American heartland then, I guess. Do you think that more protectionism will bring back manufacturing jobs to those areas, or would the collateral damage also be felt in those regions? And would, for example, reschooling or bringing people into other sectors be a better solution, for which you need government, of course?
Right, so protectionism is a word that is, again, it conceals more than it reveals. I mean, right now, the imbalances. When China joined the WTO, 6 years before that, they had devalued their currency by 40%. So everything Chinese was 40% cheaper than it was, and everything we sold to them was 40% more expensive. They developed, it's 1.2 or 3 billion people that are legitimately trying to improve their standard. And they look to the US market, because if you're going to sell something, you want to sell to wealthy people, not to somebody who doesn't have any money, right? And so the Chinese policy of subsidizing the state-owned enterprises and the like on top of the currency manipulation, they have their strategic 5-year plans. We get into the reality that trade is really a game of conflicting national interests. It's not fully win-win, and we don't care what the balance is and the like. So China had ended up with a persistent surplus, mostly on our backs, for years.
Michael, let me interrupt you. What are you suggesting? What should be done about it in a concrete
so
way?
you imbalance. So number one, you start with remedies for the currency undervaluation, and get that, because free-floating currency is supposed to remedy the balance, right? But it's not. We had an era of 2004 to 2014, which was a lot of intervention. Number two, the state-owned enterprise, countervailing duties. So it's massive subsidies. That's the current international trade rules use countervailing duties. Number three, there are some policies in these surplus countries. I mean, basically, you end up with a persistent overproduction, underconsumption. They export their underemployment. They rely on other countries to grow, and the currency's not fixing it. If the international system isn't fixing it, it may be tariffs.
Ian, let me get you into the conversation. Do you want to react to that directly?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to this issue of protectionism and free trade, but just in a broader sense. I think we've got two tensions going on. One of them is the short-term politics and the short-term reaction to what voters are saying versus long-term thinking about trade. And the second thing we've got is the issue of a free market system versus trying to help regional problems today. And the bottom line is free trade or trade is not a perfect system. There is no perfect global trade system. There will be, to some degree, winners and losers, and therefore trying to fix everything with more rules, more regulation, is going to gum up the system, and it will ultimately not lead to further prosperity. It will not lift more people out of poverty, and it won't actually fix the problems of Middle America, for example. If I take energy as just the business I know best, the world spends $7 trillion a year on its energy, and that's before we try and change the mix. That's 10% of the global economy. Energy is traded very freely around the world, and if it weren't so, we would not be able to grow anything like the rate that we're currently growing at globally. So I believe we've got a real issue here about balancing near-term industrial assistance with staying the course for a relatively simple system of free trade governed by some simple rules. If we start layering on more and more rules and regulations, sector by sector, to protect this group of people in that country and that group of people in another one, we are just going to make the world system more inefficient, and it won't ultimately benefit either the growth economies of the world, and it won't ultimately benefit the established ones.
Looking in the audience here, first question from Jack Janes. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention. Everybody has the right to one short question. Say who you are, and I will interrupt. Thanks, Jack. Go ahead.
I know, Max. I've been warned. Mr. Stumo, let me read you a headline. Trump's trade advisor, who I just think you just mentioned, Mr. Peter Navarro, who is held with great esteem in certain parts of this continent, says Germany uses euro to exploit the United States and the EU. Would you like to say whether you agree with that or not?
Somewhat, yes. Yeah, it's unintentional, but when the German currency, which in a way doesn't exist, is overvalued now. Germany has the largest, most persistent, unnatural trade surplus in the world at 8.5% of GDP. Number 2 is South Korea. Number 3 is China. And so let's say the Germans still had the Deutschmark. With Germany's doing some really good things. They make quality products. We'd like to actually emulate, my group would like to emulate a lot of what Germany does for training, for apprenticeships, that sort of thing, do good work. But what happens is when your productivity increases, you sell a lot, but then your currency rises because your economy is booming, right? And then your goods become more expensive, and you sell less, and the imports, as your currency goes up, the imports become cheaper, and so it balances out. That's what a truly free-floating currency is supposed to do in the laboratory. But because you have differential productivity rates, you have the non-German EU, the Greece, the southern EU, pulls the euro down. The German economy pulls it up. So in relation to what the German currency would be but for the euro, it's too low. So Germany's undervalued. And the 8.5%, you won't find any macroeconomist that thinks that that's indicative of balance and the way things should work.
We have a direct reaction over there. Thomas von Marschall.
Christoph Marschall,
sorry.
From a German newspaper. So you have conflicting interests. It's not Germany is the problem. You are interested that the euro is low for the Southern European countries. You are interested at the same time that the euro is high for Germany. I could just flip that around. You have different productivity in Mississippi than you have in California and so on. Just accept that Europe is as the US, and you have conflicting interests, and don't blame us. It's not Germany who is manipulating the euro. We don't have even an influence on that. So this is just words.
It happens without manipulation, true. So what's going on is the U.S. has a full union where we have a common currency, a common fiscal policy, a common regulatory policy, and a common banking system, right? So when New York makes a lot of money and Alabama is poor, we don't do Greek bailouts and lurching from bailout to bailout. There's a fiscal transfer that's occurring all the time. So it evens out. We have 12 central Federal Reserve banks all around the country. And every quarter, the New York bank always has excess money, and a lot of the others don't, especially the South. And very quietly, every quarter, they just sort of true it all up. And everyone comes back into balance. The point is that it might be that the EU should either be a full nation state with common regulatory, currency, fiscal, banking, as well as monetary, or should just be a collection of nation states, because it's hard to do it unless you have all of those mechanisms under one roof, in my view.
We have a couple of reactions in the room. I would need, I think, a microphone right here, if we have one, and for a later question over there. While we wait for the microphones, I would like to have a short voting procedure here in the room that is related to what we're doing here, because we're talking a lot about beliefs, we're talking about perceptions, and so if we have that first question on your app, you can participate. The vote question is, and we've heard part of that now here from Michael, is why is there so much opposition to free trade? And as soon as we're ready, we'll see the possible answers. I'm sure you have other answers too. But as soon as we're ready, we'll do that. Do we have the microphones in place? One over here. Why don't you ask your question and we'll do the voting later as soon as we got technology ready.
You were talking about values. So I was interested in how do you measure them? How do you set what are the priority values, and also how does it affect policies, and especially when it comes to labor market in third world countries?
Okay, I think I have to get up again because it's the Brussels fashion show setup, so I'm gonna walk around in answering. Values, I think, should be completely integrated in everything we do in the EU, whether it's internal, foreign policy, and values such as universality of human rights, preventing a race to the bottom, considering the global impact of what we do here at home. And the whole trade strategy of the current European Commission is called Trade for All, and it really goes on this starting point. So what does it mean that you give preferential access to the European market for developing economies, for example? So you actually help development in those countries by allowing products in under preferential conditions. Or, for example, when it comes to labor circumstances or the problems that people have around conflict minerals, you make sure that there are standards that the miners have to adhere to, and then you try to leverage the market on the other side so that people are incentivized to look for criteria when they purchase products. So it's a combination of setting high standards and then leveraging our own economic power to accomplish that and to use it as an incentive in other parts of the world to also increase their standards.
Is that too much regulation for you, Ian?
Yeah, look, I think the big problem is that we are trying to make the system too perfect. In the West, I think we've got so used to regulation and solving for every small imbalance that we're trying to make the system too perfect when in fact it's not perfect. And we were quite happy with an imperfect system when we were winning. And the big problem is that we're suddenly finding there are some problems appearing at home. Other people are starting to win, and suddenly the rules of the game that we've enjoyed for about the last 150 years don't work quite as well for us. And so now we're starting to fret and add more rules into the system. For businesses, what we want is predictability. And this system moves slowly and needs to move slowly. And the more we knee-jerk around in the near term, responding to populist issues, the more we upset the system and we will damage the global economy. Last point.
What to do, though, Ian?
So,
on the other side, so we know what not to do. What do you do?
What I think we have to do, and this is going to require some adjustment, we do have to pay attention to parts of the economies in Germany and the UK and the US that are not doing well. What we've done is inadvertently let some local areas go to heck, basically. We are going to have to protect them to some degree through industrial strategy, infrastructure investment. We are going to have to enable training, reskilling, apprenticeship, research. These are the things we must do, and they will be accused from time to time as being forms of protectionism. We're going to have to judge how far we're prepared to go, but to call it out now and say that the global system's not working because we suddenly find that there are some negative impacts on our economies, I believe is fundamentally wrong.
But don't you think that's what's going to happen with the UK after Brexit?
So the UK is absolutely dealing with this right now. So the government has announced an industrial strategy, and we just protected, in inverted commas, or enabled a car factory to be maintained by Nissan in the northeast of the UK. Now, it was done through undertakings around the free movement of goods and parts internationally, and that there would be a pro-business fiscal regime. Now, the question is that protectionism, or is that enablement of a sub-regional industrial strategy? I believe you could label it as either of those things. I think in the West, we're going to have to do some of the sub-regional industrial strategy enablement, but I don't believe that that is out-and-out protectionism. But the further we go on that path towards interfering with the system in multiple ways, it will damage the global economy.
Can I make two small comments in reaction? Because I think
Hang
there's...
on a second.
Oh,
Let's
yep,
do this
will
first,
do.
then your reaction, then the question.
Sure.
But of course you can. But otherwise we will never get to this, which is so brilliant, I think. You can use your app to answer that question. There's a lot of misunderstanding on free trade. I think we can all agree on that. And why is there so much opposition? There are differing views. So first answer would be many people aren't educated enough on the topic. They just don't know anything. Many elites, as you know, think that's the problem. Then many people mix up globalization, digitalization, and Ian and I talked about that earlier. Probably missing here is automatization. Third point, many people are just skeptical and want free trade to be done right. That's probably something you could agree on, Maritza, right? And four, free trade isn't that beneficial after all, and many people feel that. That would be you.
I'm on number 3, actually.
You're number 3?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. You have 15 seconds to vote. Start the vote now, please, and we'll look at the answers later. And we have a question. Oh, hang on. You wanted to react. Go ahead, Maritza.
No, I just think that what you're saying about national level measures being taken to mitigate what might be the negative impact of the macroeconomic effect of global trade rules or bilateral trade agreements is precisely what is not represented as much in the debate, is that on the national level, with knowledge of the regions, with tools such as government programming to reskill people, to help innovation as a compensation for lost industries, is actually that area where I don't see as much focus, where a lot of the solutions can come from. The other point I wanted to make is about the private sector, because I think that we also need to see, in light of this mistrust, this concern among a lot of people, we need to see a more proactive role of the private sector in making sure that income differences between those in the boardroom and the mailroom are minimized, and that there is a more fair management, if you will, also within these global companies. And I was just interested in your response in terms of what the private sector should do aside from regulation, which you're critical of.
So I completely agree with you that civil society, business and government need to work on this together. There are going to be interventions which look a bit like protectionism, but I think we've got to allow some of that. Most of it can be done through skills and investment and research and transforming the economy. But there will be casualties, and I think this is the issue.
Absolutely.
There will be
about
casualties, and we need to be honest about that.
Yep.
But businesses do have a role to play, no question.
We have a question from Simon Fraser in the back.
Yeah, Simon Fraser. I'm the managing partner of a company called Flint, but I also spent 6 years working in the European Commission on Trade policy negotiations. My question is for all the panel, but really mainly, I think, for Mr. Stumer, and it is the following, and it flows in a way from what's just been discussed. The international trade system, we've been talking about individual countries, but it's based on a multilateral system embodied in the World Trade Organization with an enforceable dispute settlement mechanism in that system. And I'd be very interested to know whether the United States administration under President Trump is going to respect the WTO and give leadership in it, or whether you feel that the US is going to be inclined to move to operate outside that system, and what the implications of that would be.
Good question. Number one, industrial policy, that's a good idea. Number two, the trade agreements do re-regulate. The TPP had 5,500 pages. It was this high. On the WTO system, we saw, you're referring to probably a document that came out of the U.S. Trade Representative's office that said they want to move away from reliance on the WTO system. And the context of that is that there's been a few cases recently where the WTO panel judges have created, in the view of even Obama's USTR, which was, pro-globalism. Michael Froman from Goldman Sachs. No, he wasn't from Goldman Sachs. Everybody else is, it seems like, but not him. Was very critical that the judges had made rulings that were far beyond the rules that were actually in the WTO agreement. So there was some dispute on that. So I think there is going to be continued pressure about mission creep for the WTO panels, and there's going to be pushback. You'll probably hear some noise, and in these days of headline writers, you have to make very, controversial headlines with fights and things like that. But Robert Lighthizer, Skadden Arps, I've met with him. I mean, Skadden Arps is this big, establishment law firm in Washington, hardly Tea Party flamethrowers, and he's been in the trade enforcement system for a long time. So if there's a push to come, they're going to be pushing back to keep the WTO tribunals within the scope of the agreement. They're going to continue to rely on a parallel set of U.S. trade laws that are specifically allowed by the WTO. But you'll probably see some, it's not exclusively the WTO. There's going to be, more on the U.S. side. So how that works out, but I don't think they're going to get out. WTO kind of irritates me at times. I'm not, we're not saying we should get out, even my organization, which again is Democrats and Republicans. So it's kind of not a lot of there ultimately, I think.
Thank you, Michael.
May I just make one brief comment?
Of course, go ahead.
Which is just that one dimension of free trade that hasn't been mentioned this morning is that it's a pillar of global security. Enabling countries to operate within a system, however imperfect, that's a known system which allows, on average, most countries to contribute and prosper, is actually a fundamental component of the stability of the world. And I just don't feel like that's got any airtime this morning. And if the US ever thought about leaving the basic framework of international trade, I think it would be a fundamental failing in the administration's attitude to global security.
Absolutely.
Well, that comes in for part one right here, because we have the results of our first voting. Many people aren't educated enough on the topic. That would be this, right?
It's a dimension of it.
It's a dimension of it. I think 3 is pretty self-explaining, and we talked about that earlier a lot. But what do you do about 1? Ian?
So I think this is a really big issue. Education, skilling, reskilling, lifelong learning, and actually helping people understand that we're going to a place we've not been before. We haven't talked about this automation issue. My fear is that for the first time in 200 years of international global trade, we're now in a place where people need to be educated that the change, some of these aspects of change are irreversible, and actually some jobs will go away and won't be replaced. And that's the real fear. And I think that's what's tipping us into this protectionist mode. We do need to drive education on the topic, but much more importantly, we need to drive education and reskilling.
I think to all the press people here, and not only, this is, how are you going to educate people on topics or inform them if everybody lives in their own bubble in social media, for example? That's something that's being discussed at the European Parliament as well. So it's clear that there's never enough education on the topic, especially on free trade with its complexity. But how do you do it?
No, but I think there's two parts to this.
Don't forget the fashion show,
I don't
everybody.
think we. No, oh yeah, I think it's. There are two parts of this. You cannot dismiss people's concerns by saying you just don't know what's going on. That's a huge mistake, unacceptable mistake. So when people are concerned about their jobs, about the loss of quality of life, about the children, about the next generation, this is real. Whether global trade is to blame is another question. And I think that has been the focus. Demonstrations against TTIP, the chlorine chicken, the Trojan horse, all the symbols of, let's say, injustice.
And these people are very good in informing their crowd. And
Well,
I say
of course,
you,
it is.
as somebody who advocates free trade, have not been. What can you do?
I think we've done something that was not too shabby because we got CETA passed in fairly difficult circumstances. And so we did I go to town hall meetings, I inform people by, the 10 most frequently asked questions on my website, go to the media, etc. But again, and I stress this very seriously, we cannot do this alone. And what I found, and what I actually think is very problematic, is that in this discussion about globalization and how it can be done well, the member state governments have continued to say, Brussels will deal with this. I've heard, for example, the trade minister in the Netherlands saying, I'm going to wage opposition against the European Commission. Sounds very heroic, but it doesn't answer those people who want to know, where is my job of tomorrow going to be? And it's too easy. Secondly, the private sector. Frankly, they lobby me. They say, oh, please make sure that CETA doesn't fail. And I'm like, I'm already there, but I'm in the wind, and I see nobody next to me. So we really need to see the bigger picture and what is at stake as well. I think the comments made about how easily the WTO can be sort of set aside are dangerous. I think the US will suffer from it. And I think we have to really...
I don't think I said that.
Well, the president said it, and you said we'll see some changes, and it's not in our favor, so we're going to push back against it.
I said they're not going to withdraw from the WTO. There's no effort to do it. And I think there's times when we need to re-educate the establishment. Because the whole idea is we have free trade or no trade. My members are saying we're the free traders. We just need to fix it because we're tolerating a new form of mercantilism that we didn't see in the 1700s.
So I agree that there's a problem there, but what we need is rules.
So the point is we're not talking no trade. So we hear no free trade or withdrawing from the system. That is, as they say these days, fake news. It's not what we're proposing.
Rules, but you just want different rules.
Well, and I think that globally agreed rules, the same rules for everybody, are important in a globally connected world. And that's why I think the WTO should actually be strengthened, not weakened. I'll keep it at that. But basically, my point was about educating the people that government cannot do it alone. It's a complete illusion. European level, where these treaties are negotiated, at least in our part of the world, cannot do it alone in no circumstance. And so we need to really rethink what are the macroeconomic benefits, what are the values we want to preserve, but then what is the impact on a national level, regional level, and for people, and how do we address this in an effective manner, really?
Marietje, I think if I may, we've become lazy. All of us. In the sense that we've taken the system for granted, we've taken for granted that people kind of know what's going on. We've all got a responsibility. And in Michael's provocation, I would say the media also has a responsibility in not propagating misinformation or just rubbish.
We have a question here. Harry.
I wanted to ask a question, but this discussion is interesting, so I want to make a point about this security. Security that comes from free trade is global. Insecurity is local. The HQ in New York decides that the factory in Czech Republic is going to close down and move away to China, and suddenly a whole area has high unemployment. You cannot educate your way out of this. You cannot explain it. They didn't do their job wrong. They did what they were told to do, and you cannot educate yourself out of it. So it's not just about education, it's about controlling the process. My question is, especially to the protectionist camp, do we acknowledge the long-term trends? Power has been shifting for decades from producers to consumers. And now we have 1.2 billion people with $100 in their pocket. And 1 billion behind them in India coming right after. So this trend, in my view, is unstoppable. So why are you promising that you can stop this?
Do you have anyone in specific you want to ask?
Mainly the protectionists.
I have to move over there, it seems.
So who would that be? Michael,
I
right?
don't think the
Okay.
protectionist camp is here, but I can answer the question.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
So there's been trade skepticism, trade agreement skepticism in the US for a while, the 90s, the 2000s, and the like. And if you look at the map, if you just consider the recent election as roughly, documenting the areas where they've been the losers rather than the winners, it wasn't just a close election. Clinton won the popular vote, but she had won 80 to 85%. I didn't vote for either one of them. I thought they were both troubling to me, right? 80 to 85% of New York, San Francisco, Chicago. If you look at the county level map, the blue areas were the big cities, right? And that she really won well. Everything in between was red. To me, that's an economic, in my view, that it's the win-lose, win-win, this whole thing, simplistic. The losers have the majority now, the position they didn't want to be in. But the income insecurity, more than inequality, it's not so much, I don't have as much as the other guys, that I don't have enough to feed my family. It's a big deal, and it's all over the country. And you look at those red areas, it's really big. You think of the U.S. as a wealthy country. You go to New York, you go to Chicago, and there's cranes and there's building. That whole area is suffering. So that has to be addressed. You can't educate your way out of it, and you just can't dismiss them as protectionists. There's something real here. We have 1 billion new people coming into the market from China, India. China's done a good job bringing their people up. The Mexicans didn't. We had the NAFTA and merged our markets. The Mexicans actually didn't get richer. I don't know why. We don't know how to handle, if we merge the US and the Chinese market, and let's say we have labor rate convergence, and we're at about $33 an hour all in, and they're at what, $2 or $3 an hour, you converge at 17, they're really happy. We're explosive. And it's not a win-win. And good for them, but we have to balance production and consumption. We can't persistently rely on someone else's consumer market to fuel our growth. And that's why I am not saying no trade. Nobody come out of here saying I'm no trade. The focus, and it's in the international system, is on balance. That's what I support. I think that's what some in the Trump administration support. I don't vouch for anything else at all there.
Do you support, for example, on a concrete level, what Warren Buffett said, $1 for each transaction?
That's WTO illegal, which does trouble me to do that. And I think, I'm not sure how it would work that well. Okay. I think there's some macroeconomic
you don't know
levers.
exactly how this was supposed to be put into action.
I think there's more going on than trade. There's policies to force savings rates. China's enforcing down consumption. The U.S. consumption as a percent of GDP is 70%. Germany's is 55%, which is low among the Euro area. China's is an unnaturally low 35% of their GDP is consumption. If you know those numbers, it's like never before. It's alien. It's weird in its government policy. So there's more rebalancing than just the trade in the whole system.
Before we come to the gentleman up there, 1 second, because we've had a question for a long time from Ryan Heath, who, because I ignored him, chose to write it down. Sorry, Ryan. Millions of people in the West are saying they place a higher value now on security of identity and on stable communities over getting 1% to 2% richer by making trade frictionless. How can trade advocates win in that context? Anyone specifically you want this to answer? Maritza, go ahead.
I think we're right in this already, where on the one hand there are voices that are much more critical of anything global, who want to recreate borders, who want to go back to the more national level. But there's also support, I mean, we've just seen it in the Dutch elections, for a stronger global perspective, but also underlining that it should be based not on a sort of endless race to the lowest common denominator, which is also what our Greek friend here was alluding to, but rather, should have in it a deepening also of some of those principles that are, I think, part of our identity. For example, in Europe, that we have over time seen more protection of the environment, stronger protection of labor rights, better consumer protection. So I think it is an integral approach, but you already see a slowdown of the ambition, of the effectiveness to work on trade rules. I don't think it's beneficial for the people that we actually should have in mind. But it is indeed a reality that we will have to keep fighting in the arena of ideas.
Another question from the audience, Ilter Turan, who's been waiting a long time as well.
My name is İlter Turan. I'm from Istanbul Bilgi University and the current president of the International Political Science Association. I have two short questions. The first one is the growing presence of retired people has not really entered the discussion very much, because increasingly we are going to have a segment of the population that is not working, but that is going to rely on the delivery of other people who are working. And this growth has already produced some political outcomes, and I just want the speakers to see how we're going to address this problem, because it's a complicating factor. The other question is, Ian made this point, and this has been a recurrent theme in the earlier discussions, and says we need leadership. I mean, in the past we have had leadership. It seems that we're not getting it now. Why aren't we having leaders now? Now, I have my answers, but I'll spare you from my answers and wait for you.
I'm sure they're very interesting, Ilter, but this seems to be in your ballpark, especially the leadership part. Ian, you want to react?
Well, look, I think, I'm not sure I'm saying we're not producing leaders. I think the problem has become much, much more difficult. This issue of a globalized world where we've now got economies that have been prospering continuously for 100 years, suddenly finding they're not, and issues such as your first part of your question, aging populations, and the issue of what the definition of work is, when do you finish it, how do you have a fulfilling life in the later stages. These are all big challenges. When you multiply it with this other issue, which I do think is unprecedented, which is the march of technology and the pace of change. It's the pace of change. I believe the leadership challenge for people running countries, companies, any institution is huge. It's probably unprecedented. And that's why I think we've not got leadership, because we actually aren't up to the task. And last
point. What's your advice, Ian?
Well,
what's your advice to future leaders? What should they do?
Think long term.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't work in politics, right, Maricha?
That's, if I may, if it doesn't work in politics, there's something wrong with politics.
Well, that's an easy one to conclude. I think that there is a slight problem there. But
come on over, Maricha, join us.
No, but I mean, I think it's true that too many politicians are more concerned about not only the next election but also their next job, to take risk in formulating these often unpopular visions. Because it's not an easy message to say to the young generation, you will not have as good a pension as your parents did. It's not a great program to say, oh, you're going to have to work longer, or we're going to have to reform the system of pensions or social welfare, because otherwise our children will not benefit. It's a very tough message, but you have to bring it. And I do believe, actually, we should not underestimate people. And I also see in my own party's growth over the past years, where we have advocated for difficult and controversial reforms of government finance, where we have made the case for openness of economies, openness of democracies, open-mindedness, welcoming attitude towards people who flee war. And there's definitely a segment of society that is really longing for this kind of leadership. And I think we also need to stop talking about the people don't want this, the people don't want that. The reality is the people don't agree. And I'm going to go for this agenda where I think the solutions will be sometimes long-term, sometimes short-term. And you have to take risk. One of the best advices that somebody ever gave to me was when I asked a very wise gentleman in our Council of State, what advice would you give me as a relatively young politician? He said, serve with your resignation letter in your hand. And I think that that's what more people should be doing.
We're about to wrap it up, but if we have two of our audience members who have been waiting for a long time as well, two short questions, and we'll answer them both at the same time, okay?
Thank you, Max. My question is for Michael. My name is Dania Khatib. I've been following Trump campaign closely, and I have to admit he has an attractive narrative: "Make America Great Again." 30,000 factories have closed down because of all the work has been transferred to China. The American, quote unquote, doesn't have job because of Mexicans, but. Do you think his plan, with his plan, it's an attractive narrative, but is it executable with his plan? Will these 30,000 factories open again and give jobs to, I don't think so personally, but what do you think? Thank you.
And we'll take the second question right after that.
I'm Harlan Ullman. I'm a recovering rationalist. I think the problem with using the term free trade is a misnomer and oxymoronic, and it gets you stuck in a current account. There are inequalities, comrades, and I think the term should be fair trade. And I think if you change the debate to fair trade from free trade, you're going to open up many, many vistas for better ideas than we're hearing right now.
So we have one question for Michael.
Some jobs are going to come back. Even the institute, there's a Peterson Institute in Washington that's very pro-free trade, and I'm using it. You can't, fair trade, whatever it is. But the current trading system, with the advent of China, for us, they're half of we had $760 billion goods deficit. China's half of our trade deficit. Even the folks that don't agree with me that just everything's fine, please move along, agree that if we rebalanced with some of the Asian countries, mostly China, because they're just quantitatively far and above anything else in our metrics. There's about 4 million jobs for us. That's a really big deal. Mexico, you can debate either way. You have your opinions. I think China's a clear-cut case. Mexico's not.
The question is, though, what China's going to do if the U.S. adopts any measures.
They have to rebalance to rely more on their internal consumption for their growth, and the treasuries, secretaries, and the G20 have been telling that for years, and the presidents of China have been stating that for years, that we have unbalanced, unsustainable economic development, even as their savings, investment, consumption, and current account rates continue to be mostly more imbalanced on most of those issues. So there's not a debate that they need to rebalance.
And what should they do about the $1 trillion+ of U.S. debt that the Chinese are holding? Will they just sit there and say, that's fine, we'll deal with the trade imbalance issues, but we're not going to get mad about the U.S. growth on the back of Chinese-fueled financing?
So actually, right now, they're spending that down pretty fast, trying to keep the renminbi from collapsing. It's a different relationship. Sovereign funds, it's a whole other seminar, but sovereign funds like that are not to be thought of as our own bank accounts, that we have $1 trillion in the bank account. There's a set of different dynamics, and I think, I'm not going to go into that further, but that doesn't necessarily trouble me, but the accumulation of it was because of 10 years of manipulation, because they had to buy dollars to force the dollar up. Now they're spending to force their own currency up.
I think this questioner over here was closer to the mark, which is we've got to understand our current reality. And some aspects of our current reality are different to our prior reality, and we need to understand that first and deal with it.
The reality is the IMF rules, Article 4 says, thou shalt not manipulate your currency for a trade advantage. That's part of the Bretton Woods system.
I doubt the Chinese would think they did.
WTO Article 15 says it's actionable. And there's some procedural problems with making it actionable, but there's no debate that currency manipulation is a violation of international trade rules.
I think everybody's getting tired. You're not getting up anymore. So it's time for the last vote, and then we'll wrap it up, if we can make that work here. And since we tried to find, forward-looking solutions, of course, we can't solve the world here today, but I think we heard some things. We want leadership was called for, thinking long-term, for example, making the values count. And I think, Marietje, it's safe to say that what you're propagating is, just keep on chipping at the stone with your town halls, for example, trying to explain to people what the value is of what you are doing when you try to endorse free trade under certain conditions.
Well, but we're not creating agreements today that are the same as 30 years ago. We are innovating, and we need information from people what they care about, because we represent them in setting modern 21st century rules that take into consideration these concerns, or that focus on new areas. For example, digital trade. We haven't really talked about that. Should be interesting topic for another time, but there's hardly any rules there, while there's massive global companies. And so you want to make sure that you adjust as policymakers to both demands and needs in changing society.
And don't forget, this is just the first part of this second plenary, so I'm sure there'll be more on that. But before we come to that, this is the last vote. We tried to anticipate a little bit what we would talk about, so of course this is incomplete, but I think it'll be interesting nevertheless. Which of these solutions do you endorse most strongly? Just keep on pushing free trade, people will come around. Or number two, keep current policies, improve communication on the benefits of those policies. Number three, make trade agreements more social, improve communication as well. Number four, reduce free trade, focus on balanced and fair trade. Is that you? Number four?
Yeah.
That's you, okay.
Number four. Yeah.
All right, and number five is scrap free trade. It's a false solution and only benefits the big companies. We really haven't talked about that, Ian. No time, but whoever wants to talk to Ian about that later can do it. So voting is on, another 11 seconds. And in the meantime, I would like to thank our panelists.
Thank you.
We are aware that this is a huge topic. We can't talk about everything, but I thought it was great, so thank you. And just in time, we should have the results. More social, improved communication. There you go. Thank you very much. And I would like to say that my esteemed colleague, Jonathan Will, who's just entering the room right here, very well known from the Washington Post and MSNBC, will do the second part of this plenary session.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, first panel. And since we don't have a whole lot of time, I want to introduce our panel now. Coming to the stage are Dex Torek-Barton. He is a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Ted Howard is president and co-founder of Democracy Collaborative, and Elizabeth Collette is director of Migration Policy Institute Europe. We do not have a whole lot of time to have this conversation. Where is my question that I want everyone to give me words for this word cloud? You can put that up here, and if you go to your Spot Me app, I think you'll be able to vote, or not vote, but give me words to fill in this word cloud if it were to pop up. And I believe, if my memory serves, the question is, what are the causes for the erosion of community? And in the previous panel, they talked all about the economy and trade, and what we're going to do now is talk about ideas, interconnectivity, and identities. And since the last panel was on the economy, I want to start with Ted with his opening remarks.
Thank you, Jonathan. In my brief few minutes, I'd like to put on the table 5 propositions to you. First, the issue of real concern for us here is less reactionary populism that we've been talking about for the last day and a half, with an emphasis on reactionary, may I say, and more the underlying socioeconomic causes and dynamics that give rise to this reactionary phenomenon. My second proposition, while not the only source, growing economic inequality and the escalating wealth gap are at the heart of the current crisis we're facing, which is manifesting itself in this right-wing populism. At the core of today's global capitalism, I believe, is a set of institutional relationships, private credit creation, capital markets, the giant publicly traded corporation that is unrelenting in concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer hands. I'm from the United States. Let me give you just a couple data points. For decades, virtually all of the gains in the US economy have been captured by the very rich, while the vast majority received a declining share of increasing productivity. Real wages for 80% of American workers have been flat for at least 3 decades. Moreover, the U.S. income distribution looks positively egalitarian when compared to wealth ownership, with the top 10% now commanding over 3/4 of the total. Taken together, the richest 400 people in the United States now have more wealth than the bottom 186 million of our citizens. These are feudal, medieval wealth holding patterns. Is it any wonder that people who are being left behind in this way, who are being marginalized, are in open rebellion against the system? If you were in their shoes, would you not be also? Is it any wonder that our liberal democracy is deeply threatened? My third proposition, this growing inequality is not an aberration. It can be clearly traced to the unfettered neoliberal economic policies that nations are pursuing and people in the US and Europe are openly rebelling against. See Trump, see Brexit, see Le Pen, and many more. 4, to get out of this mess, we need a systemic approach to building a new economic order based on new principles. That among these are the primacy of fairness, equity, inclusion, broad-based and local ownership, and the reinforcement of the values of community, all of which, I assert, have been severely eroded in the past several decades. And 5th, there are ways forward. If we are willing to address the crisis not at the margins, but at the very heart of the system, let me suggest 4 ways. Creating locally based public banks and financial institutions so that communities have access to and the control of capital they need to invest in their future. Second, reinforcing economic democracy through dramatically expanding community and employee ownership, which has been proven to be a superior model for organizing productive enterprise and benefiting working people. Third, rejecting the fetishism of privatization of social services and the commons while encouraging decentralized public ownership of capital, enterprise, energy, and much more. And most importantly, recognizing that we have a systemic crisis that requires deep-seated systemic solutions. So the final point I would make is we need the courage to recognize that our system has fundamental flaws. And we need to invent the basis for a next system beyond state socialism, beyond corporate capitalism, beyond neoliberalism. In short, we need to rebuild the economic basis for democracy in the 21st century, starting in our communities and building up from there.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
And you say starting in our communities. I'm going to come over to you, Dex, because after the election of Donald Trump, you traveled around the United States trying to understand why people would vote for President Trump. And what did you come away with from that experience in terms of, well, actually, how did that experience come to help define your vision of community?
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump are caricatured by the press and by pundits as uniformly being a bunch of xenophobes and by a bunch of, bomb-throwing extremists who want to overthrow, the global order. And what I found is the vast majority of people who voted for Donald Trump and, right now are wearing Make America Great baseball caps, they chose him because they do not see any other means to defend their way of life and to seek solutions to the crippling social and economic challenges in their communities. For too many people living in too many communities in the places I visited, places like Ohio and Idaho and down to Florida and Texas, there are communities which have seen their way of life completely transformed by the forces of globalization. They have seen that there are too many losers and not enough winners in that system. And far too often, the people who seem to be the winners of globalization are people in rooms just like this, people like you and me. We are the 1%, let's be clear about that. We are the people who have enjoyed all the advantages in life. We live as part of this global community that feels enlightened and dares to think of the solutions to the great global challenges of our time. But those solutions have yet to find their way to places in Ohio and Texas. And if we cannot find ways to overcome some of those sharpest effects of globalization, we will see the liberal world order and the things that we believe in, that we know have benefited humanity in the world for decades, we will see those things go away. They will pass into history because they are not loved by anyone and they have left too many people behind. But I'll tell you this, even though I think technology has played a very important role in undermining some of the traditional social and economic fabric of those communities, it has also helped create new communities. At dinner last night, somebody pointed out to me that you are clearly Donald Trump's worst fevered nightmare. I'm a guy who has a British accent, which first of all makes me a supervillain. I look Asian. I am an immigrant to the United States. My mother was an immigrant from Asia. My father was a refugee. And I used to work at the United Nations and at Facebook. I literally cross off all of the nightmare Fox News dreams. And as I combine those very different backgrounds and experiences, I actually do feel that I am something beyond the nativist or nationalist model that many politicians would love to impose on their societies. I consider myself a citizen of the world, truly. I love Britain. I love the country I was born in. I love America, the country I live in now. But I also have a greater allegiance to a global community. I believe that trade, when it works, free trade, is something that is good. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It has moved our world forward. I believe in global security. I believe in dealing with global threats like climate change. I think that people should stand together to solve our common problems, not simply retreat into a shell. I don't think the truth to humanity or to our lives or whatever we're looking for can be found just in our backyard. It can sometimes be found by reaching out and building bridges across the world. That global community is perhaps our strongest chance at rebuilding faith in that global liberal world order. We must unite the citizens of the world and make it more than just some sentimental epithet that people like me talk about in rooms like this. We must make it a true political force that can stand up and be as powerful and recognized as the people who wear those baseball hats which say, "Make America Great Again." I don't want to do that, I want to make Earth great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So a rousing speech. But this is not a campaign. So
I endorse this message.
Elizabeth, now to bring this hyper local, given your work and given what we've just heard from Ted and from Dex, add to the conversation from your perspective.
I mean, what's really interesting to hear today is that communities are clearly fragmenting across a number of lines. And when we talk, increasingly now, identity politics is becoming a feature of our everyday news. And when we talk about identity, migration, and the integration of immigrants, how are immigrants integrating into our world, has become the flashpoint of many of those conversations, particularly when it comes to different cultures. But I think, as we see here, it's emblematic of a broader societal fragmentation, and this is one of the challenges. We start to think about the integration of immigrants into communities as integration of a diverse group of people into what is a cohesive, seamless whole with a solid identity that we can articulate. And that, clearly, hearing our other speakers, is just not the case. We have a divide between rural and urban communities. We have an increasing generational divide, the baby boomers and the aspiring hipsters, and those who are systemically socially excluded from society. And so immigrants are moving into what is already a quite fragmented and difficult environment. And we sometimes, I think, underestimate that. We also assume that identity is a static concept, and particularly in our fast-paced world, and we're hearing about digital change, we hear about the fast pace of trade and capitalism. We also assume that many of our identities are both static and easy to articulate. And one of the challenges we face right now is that publics are increasingly asking their governments to articulate a concept of identity that sets out the parameters of what is good and what is bad behavior, and to articulate values that I think we fail to be very specific about. A good example here is the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, taking out a full-page advert in a number of Dutch newspapers saying, "Be normal or go home." I'm not entirely sure I want a career politician defining normality for me, certainly as a British national, having seen many of our politicians in the UK. But the idea that there is such a thing as normal in a particular country, and that this can be policed through policy, both the articulation of our values and then policing and arbitrating the harder edges of them, is something we're going to have to contend with. But I'm going to add also that I think I agree with you that this room is not representative of broader communities, and it's not representative when you look at that screen up there and see how small migration is. Outside of this room, people would put migration at a higher level and give it greater importance when talking about community and identity. And as I said, these are very changing concepts. Typically, and German Marshall Fund has done polling over the last decade, people overestimate the scale of migration into their countries. Scale is actually fairly static. The numbers are still fairly low and have remained, at any given moment, the number of people who are an immigrant remains around 3, maybe even creeping up to 4%. But two things we overlook. One is super diversity, that we have an increasing number of nationalities, an increasing number of types of immigration. We're not talking about large singular communities. We're not talking about a large Hispanic community in the US, for example. If you look at large metropolises, they are made up of hundreds of nationalities with very different backgrounds, education levels, skills, and needs. And the second aspect is churn. In our communities, particularly in metropolitan areas, people come in and out of the community, and that's not necessarily just immigrant groups. It's high achievers who come into a community for 2 years and then leave a community after those 2 years and don't really participate. And I think what we've heard here today are 3 versions of hollowing out of community from very different perspectives. So how are we going to work harder to rebuild and maintain local communities that prove so essential to people's sense of security in a context where there is this fast-paced movement? And I'll just leave you with an example from here in Brussels. When people talk about problems of immigrant integration in Brussels, they tend to mean Molenbeek, and they tend to mean Moroccan communities. When I look at Brussels, I actually think the bigger problem is the unspoken one, which is EU officials working in institutions who come in and out, who don't learn the language, who don't participate in the local community very much at all, but we don't talk about them because they've bought themselves out of that system. So I think it's not just a case of looking at the socially excluded at the lower end, it's also a case of looking at the participation at the higher end. What are we all going to do to contribute and become part of these communities in the future, to reinforce a sense of identity when we connect across geographies more than we connect within them?
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I need two things at the moment. One is a handheld mic, if I could. Thanks. And then the second thing I need is actually, it's a person. And I am looking for him because, as you notice, we have 3 panelists and 1 empty chair that I've just been sort of occupying for a little bit. But I want that 4th chair to be occupied by Dr. Justin Guest, who's a professor at George Mason University, who has written a book. Look, come here, Justin. Here, I'll take your bag. Here, and take this. Come this way, please. Have a seat. Have a seat here.
I can assure everyone I have not prepared for this.
So, got to keep it interesting. So, given what everyone here has just said, especially what Elizabeth and Dex talked about in terms of community, I kept thinking about the book you've written, where you talked about the feelings of hopelessness of white working class people in the United States and in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom. And I thought what you'd written was actually very interesting and pertinent to this discussion. One of the reasons why I wanted to have this question, what are the reasons for the erosion of community and identity around the world, is I was wondering if a particular word would not show up in that word cloud. And I'm actually quite happy that I see that word in there, but it's not as big as I think it should be. And that word is racism. Actually, I think a word that should be in there should be really, given what you've written, is supremacy. And what's happening here in terms of hollowing out of communities and a lack of identity is the fact that there are a lot of people a lot of, in the instance of what you've written, Dr. Guest, is a bit of nostalgia that white working class people in the United States and Great Britain have about the past. Very briefly, I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to talk about better what I just said, since you've written the book.
No pressure.
Real quickly. You could do it. You're a professor.
So, professors prepare.
You're prepared.
So, I would challenge everyone to think about what Dex referred to: make America great again. Imagine if the word...
Walk around.
All right. Imagine if the word again was not part of that slogan. Imagine if it was just Donald Trump, make America great. He would have lost. Because by using the word again, Donald Trump taps into that yearning, that nostalgia for the past. Many white working class people today yearn for a time when there was greater prosperity, when there's greater stability in their lives. And so when they look at the past, it feels pretty great. But for people of minority backgrounds, it's harder to look at the past and remove it and divorce it from the social ills, from the racial hierarchies, from the sense of oppression and discrimination. And so by Make America Great Again as your slogan, the election in the United States was a referendum on America's past. So when it comes to a sense of identity that we're talking about today, I think, what white working class people are feeling and what's motivating this sense of vulnerability amongst them is a sense that their heritage, their authenticity, their ownership, their control of their own countries has loosened and is slipping through their fingers. They feel like their sense of Britishness, Americanness, Danishness is somehow cheapened when it is shared with immigrants who naturalize, who desperately want to become Danes, who want to become Britons. Even though they look different, they may practice a different faith, they may have different preferences and culture, they may have slightly different attitudes. But that sense of cheapening of the identity, that sense of losing a sense of authenticity and shifting the value of heritage over to newcomers who show up, spend a few years, and then get in citizenship is what's irking white working class people.
So, Professor, on that, because that's a great crystallization of, and that's exactly what I was hoping you would talk about. So given that, given what Professor Guest just said, how, and I want this to be a conversation among the four of you, how do you create community given that there is a significant portion of the population that is nostalgic and wants to go back to another time, when there is another significant portion of the community that wants to be a part of the community, whether that's in Great Britain, whether that's in the United States, whether that's in, you name it. Dex, Elizabeth, Ted, jump in. Yes, Wendy. I guess we're going to the Q&A portion. Wendy Sherman.
So I'm just a little frustrated by all of us, myself included. Back in 2002, when Pew Global Attitudes Project began and they surveyed 44 countries, most of them in the developing world, people liked what they got from globalization. Better food choices, better pharmaceuticals, cell phones. My favorite data is the Vietnamese love cell phones, the best thing ever that happened. Only 10% of them had cell phones. But they thought this would be great and wonderful and change their life. But they were terrified of losing their identity and their sense of self as modernity came to their lives. So whether it is the Arab Spring or the US election, the phenomena is not just a developed world phenomena. In fact, the developing world was experiencing this anxiety of loss of sense of self and identity long before we were. And in the United States, this concern about identity is not new. When the Italians came, the Irish hated them. I can't remember the order in which people came. But, you know, if you look at the streets of Chicago, the gangs of New York,
right,
the phenomenon is not new. I think the issue for all of us is the space that has opened up in the fast pace of change and the acceleration of this change. But the phenomenon is not a new one. And so, as elite, which we all are, I think we're doing some navel gazing as opposed to going to the real core issues here and how we solve it,
so then,
as opposed to reflect on it.
So then, Ambassador Sherman, give me, so how do we solve that? Give me one idea.
I think the solving is having policies that actually deal, as was discussed a little bit in the prior group, which is in the United States, we've never had trade adjustment assistance that's worth crap. We don't have a way to reskill people as they go through life. We don't have policies that are keeping up with change. So when artificial intelligence is on its way, we have no plan or policy at a government level to deal with that. So we have to get real and do actual things.
Thanks, Ambassador Sherman. Ted, what do you make of what Ambassador Sherman said? And if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Anyone back there? Ted. Ted, please react to what Ambassador Sherman said.
Not sure I agree completely.
Oh, even better.
Especially given my opening remarks. It is true in the United States we have this long and contentious sort of nativist history with immigrants coming into our country. I think what's different now, however, I live in Cleveland, Ohio. Ohio went for Trump very strongly. I think what's happening now is we are in a situation for the people, the white working class people of America, seeing immigrants coming in, where the pie does not feel like it's growing for everybody. So the pie's clearly growing. There's more and more wealth, but all the gains are going to a certain place. So that's why I think if we're going to deal with these problems, including immigration and including community, we've got to be dealing with the nature of the wealth inequality that is pitting everybody against everybody else. Okay, good.
Great. Just so that this doesn't become a United States conversation, I just want to make sure that whoever, you have the next question that's on Europe. Perfect.
Thank you. I have a small comment to Ted because he's focused so much on wealth, equality, and this.
And quickly.
Yes, very quickly. I think the rebellion that Europe sees now is because of this obsession, the failure of the socialist system, because there's almost an obsession with wealth redistribution that didn't amount to happier people. It amounted to people who don't want to work more, because the more you work, the more money you'll have to pay to the government. You have so much focus on wealth redistribution instead of focusing on wealth creation and creation of opportunities. Thank you.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think I quite agree, but I think we are in a situation of wealth redistribution. People are working harder than ever, but they're not seeing the gains. So the wealth is being redistributed, but it's being redistributed up there. So what I'd like is everybody to get a fair share from the labor that they're contributing to their workplaces. I don't think that's socialism. I think it makes sense.
Okay, real fast. And do you still have your question next? Okay, very quickly.
I want to offer a different hypothesis. 70% of Americans believe that their children and grandchildren are not going to have lives as well as they are. I think the motivating factor is fear. You're an American family, you have two working parents, probably have a couple $100,000 in debt from education, healthcare is a mess, and you're afraid. That is translated into anger. And that's what motivated, in my mind, both Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders. And unless you get to a situation in which government becomes competent, I made this point yesterday, I think the greatest danger we face is failed or failing government. That is the heart of the matter. And until you get to that point, then I think we're in huge trouble.
That's an interesting point.
Jonathan, they're right. The
people
those
Justin
70,
Dex, I would love your reaction to what he just said.
Those 70% of people who believe their children are going to be worse off are right. All the numbers show that immobility is an all-time low, that is on an all-time high. People are not moving up in the class structure, and it's because we are not, in order to create wealth, it's the people who are already wealthy who are creating wealth. People are not able to move up in their society. The American dream is dead. And amongst my white working class subjects, those who believe in the American dream, it's effectively an opiate. It is just lulling them into complacency. Whereas in reality, they need to actually fight for a more equal system that allows people to move up in society. And that's not something about just white people. That's for white people, brown people, black people. It affects everyone evenly.
Dex?
Yeah, I agree with the point about fear. I think we live in a time where we have really extraordinary global crises that are taking place. You know, we live in a time with the greatest humanitarian crisis of our times underway right now, more refugees than at any point in history. We live in a time when Russia is subverting the entire system of Euro-Atlantic security. People see these events taking place all over the world, and I think there is a perception, this is what I heard from a lot of people in the communities I visited in the United States, the people who repeatedly, we have been told, don't care about the rest of the world and don't care about foreign affairs and only vote about things in their backyard. They have said, we don't feel like America is in control of events anymore. We don't feel that the West is in control of events anymore. We've gone from this world where we had a generation of politicians who talked about the European project and talked about globalization with a purpose, the purpose being to unite us so we can solve these things at greater scale to make lives better for everyone, to a generation of politicians and institutions that are technocrats who say that we're going to try and create incremental change to manage these things, but have proven repeatedly that they are incapable of managing these things. There is a fear because things are genuinely not being managed well in the world. I think there's a substantive problem.
So there's a question here.
Thank you, Lisa Lutzevich, Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. I agree with Ambassador that identity is as old as the world, and threat to identities were coming throughout civilization from all kinds of ventures. I would like to suggest two solutions to how we could bind communities together. I think number one is we are afraid of what we don't know of foreign. I think we have to have public policies that prevent modern-day segregation, which exists all over big and small communities. And number two is allowing multiple identities, ensuring that people are secure to be Ukrainian, European, a global citizen. And this is something local politics is not taking into account, and something that we should be all looking for policy responses to these two problems. Thank you.
Quick reaction to that? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
But I think it's important to raise this because this has become, everyone's gone to their safe territory, which is economics. We all feel comfortable talking about fear and economics. We feel very, very uncomfortable talking about culture and interaction and trust.
Exactly.
And what we see is speed of change, high churn, but we also see lots of different communities who don't necessarily interact that much, and cultural differences that need to be managed. The go-to for many governments has been to say, well, we can manage that for you. And the go-to for many populists has said, we can manage this for you. We can manage this feeling of insecurity you have on cultural issues. The governments actually need to think very carefully about what their role is. When does the government intervene in these issues, and when does it stand back and say a community has to find its own way? And we focus on economic issues because they make us comfortable. Populist and many far-right parties are focusing on the cultural issues because they know that that actually is part of this issue that we're too afraid to get into.
Okay, so since we're too afraid to go there, and I'm trying to get us there, and you have wonderfully thrown that into the conversation, and also with this question up here, where's the conversation about the rapid rise of white supremacy and urgent measures to address this radicalization? Elizabeth, since you said that the safe zone is economics and it's an uncomfortable conversation, be more uncomfortable. What's the thing that we should be talking about? What should we be focusing on? If governments can't control or manage this in the way that they think they can, what do you think governments should be doing?
So I think what we tend to do in Europe is when we're faced with the hard edges. I once wanted to write a book called "Integration is Boring If You're Doing It Right," because actually integration processes should be really dull and technocratic. But they hit our headlines at the edges of the cultural issues when we're talking about headscarves, whether we're talking about bikinis and whether you can wear them or not. And instead of asking the question of should we be arbitrating these issues and through what processes should we be having these conversations, what framework do we have these conversations, we go immediately into the rights and wrongs of whether someone should wear a bikini or not. We have not created a governance framework that people feel comfortable that someone is going to take responsibility for when there is a hard edge of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in society, and when there's a need for sort of community mediation. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is if I hear one more time in the European context, people talk about European values and not articulate it beyond some very, very broad and unhelpful rhetoric. I hear far-right groups talking about, I'm going to defend your European values. I hear President Juncker talking about how he's going to defend my European values, and no one's telling me what those are. For me, the concept of tolerance is great. Tolerance is very difficult to distinguish from apathy in a great number of cases. We have failed to be specific about what it means to talk about values in a community context, but then also how that creates European identities, national identities, local identities, and exactly right, multiple overlapping identities where actually we have more in common than we do separate. So I think we have to get into those sorts of discussions once we have the framework.
I love that you brought that up. We now have less than 8 minutes left, and we got to the nub of what I wanted to get to. I would love for Justin, Dex, Ted, react to what Elizabeth said, and we'll try to squeeze in 2 more questions.
Yeah, so let's talk about supremacy for what it is, right? Let's actually get to the heart of this. When people say that they feel out of control, and this is a word that we hear a lot, they're not just feeling out of control of their lives, they're feeling out of control of their country. They feel like their society no longer belongs to them. But who is them? It is often white men. And when you have in the United States a black president for 8 years, and the prospect of the first female president for 4 more years or 8 more years, it is discomforting for many people. It is discomforting to see that lack of control, and that control was a history, a legacy of white supremacy. And it doesn't make you a supremacist. It just makes you uncomfortable to see change in your country. And when cultural values that are different from your own are being not necessarily championed or made superior, but just made equal, you sense relative loss. You used to be up here in your society. You used to feel like you had a perch, and no longer you somehow feel equal with people who just showed up at your borders.
So that's a great analysis, but then what do you do about it? How do you convince that person who feels this sense of loss that they haven't lost anything?
So the hardest leap, I think, here, the hardest leap philosophically for, I think, Europeans in particular to make, but Americans have the same challenge, is to recognize that when you admit new people into your country, you are changing the composition of that country. And when you change the composition of a democracy, your country is going to change. You cannot have immigrants in just as this pair of hands that makes things for you or that serves things to you. They bring with them culture. They bring with them attitudes, preferences, desires, hopes, dreams. Those things cannot be discounted simply because they're newcomers. Because at some point, all of us were newcomers to this world. When we moved to a city, when we moved to a region, when we moved to a country, when we moved to a neighborhood. And we still should be able to matter.
And some move by choice, and others move by force. Question here, very quickly, because I want to squeeze in 1 more.
Yeah, Heinrich Kreft, I'm currently the German ambassador to Luxembourg. Huge inequality, growing inequality in the US, but I'm missing 1 word, taxation. So why are the Americans shying away from higher taxation, given that 80% of the population haven't seen a wealth increase in 30 years?
Ted?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd be president.
Well, I think, given what
Maybe
Elizabeth
because all the
said,
money's
falling
going to
back
the
into this
military.
conversation about economics and taxation, I think that's a good response. Last question right here. And I apologize to all those hands that I saw go up, but I have no time. Very quickly.
So just to frame this debate a little bit more, because I do want to bring in, I guess, a little bit less PC language. I am a queer black woman from the American South. And so when I hear people talking about things like white supremacy and radicalization, the part that I'm often missing is like the very real fear, but also the violence that gets perpetrated against people like me in my region of the United States. White supremacist hate groups are on the rise. They've risen exponentially since 2016, since the beginning of Donald Trump's presidency. My question to you is, what place does like the real concerns of people in minority communities who are outside of this space, how do we bring that type of language into, like, in here, in this elitist bubble? Because until we're crafting policy for those people, I really don't think we're talking about much of relevance.
And that is a great way to end, and I'm going to, because we have no time, Elizabeth Collette, do you have a response?
No,
quickly.
I think it's incredibly important. What we've seen in Europe is the rise of a lot of anti-discrimination forums and rules, et cetera, that don't necessarily implement or think through those issues. But for me, a lot of it comes down to also community empowerment as well, and taking this outside of here. And you can have a policy framework, and that's great. But if there's no buy-in and there's no real implementation at the community level, I agree.
Dex Turek-Barton.
Yeah, my answer would be for every community that is under attack, we need to resist. We need to stand up to those politicians and to those forces that are attacking those groups and to advocate for the approaches that we really believe are humane and actually defend the rights of people from there. The internet and global communities are giving us unprecedented power to do that today. We were just chatting backstage before this group came on about how there's a secret Facebook group where there's tens of thousands of organizers from movements all over the world who are fighting on exactly these issues, sharing tactics and resources. Even though that we live in this moment where it seems that everything's coming to an end and the world's in chaos, there are also many, many people who are working to fight back and to use technology to do positive things.
Ted Howard.
I think we need to acknowledge, and this comes from someone who actually feels patriotic and loves my country. This country of the United States was built on the expropriation of labor from black people, the expropriation of land from indigenous people, and the taking away of about 10 territories from Mexican people, brown people, California, Colorado, Texas, and so forth. And until we get real and are willing to have a conversation that we cannot talk about economics in the United States without talking about race, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's a conversation that needs to be built intentionally by you and me.
And special guest number one, Professor Justin Guest.
There is a desire to sanitize politics from race. There's a desire to sanitize politics from discussions of immigration and ethnicity. And there is a desire to divorce American history, European history, from very ugly pasts. But we have to recognize that these kinds of attacks that you're referring to do not affect people inside of this bubble. We live in neighborhoods that are not affected in that way. We are not subject to those kinds of attacks, and we don't feel that. But that's why it's so important to have people like yourself inside this bubble. And we need to look around rooms that we're in and say, am I actually getting every voice here? Am I getting a diversity of voices in the room so that we can be aware of these trends?
Thank you very much. Again, my apologies to all those hands that went up for questions. I apologize for not getting to you. Panelists, thank you. And please welcome back Ali Aslam.
Thank you, thank you. No, Jonathan, you're going to come with me. It's no going for you. I know it's time for a coffee break, and we've been in this room for quite some time, so I'm going to make this quick and short. But I do want to take this opportunity, Jonathan, because oftentimes I'm a journalist, you're a journalist. How many journalists here in the room? Let me see. Few. You can out yourself. That's okay. No shame in that. No shame in this profession. Okay, because
6, 7?
bubble. We're talking about bubble, right. Jonathan, and it's no coincidence that Donald Trump often refers to journalists as fake news, because this is exactly what he's trying to get, saying you're not telling the truth. And let's be true, the Washington Post, the New York Times, all other major outlets dropped the ball during the election time, right? None of it called the election of Donald Trump. My question to you, as a prestigious journalist and representative from the Washington Post, what, if anything, has changed in your boardroom, in your editorial room, in the newsroom, in the United States? Have there been changes? Because it's very easy for us to stand here and ask for accountability from the politicians and policymakers and think tanks. But let's be self-critical here for a second. What have we done? Where have we changed?
Look, on the editorial board of the Washington Post, we took Donald Trump very seriously, especially when he started attacking judges, when he attacked Judge Curiel. And we decided early on that that was a bridge too far, that we had to take him seriously and take what it would mean for him to be president as a threat to democracy. Since he's been elected president, we have been, and again, I'm speaking for about the editorial board, we've been very focused not only on what he's proposing policy-wise, but the larger view of what he's doing and what that means to American government, American character, who we are as a people in the United States. I think for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the White House press corps, I think we have seen journalism, particularly in Washington, but in the United States, reinvigorated, because now there is a president that challenges facts, that challenges truth, who challenges who we are as a country. And again, I know we're in Belgium, so when I say we, I'm thinking, I'm standing in Washington, but I'm standing in Belgium. But in the United States, I think journalism has been, again, reinvigorated, and I think, quite frankly, views itself sort of implicitly as, our job is to hold the president accountable, hold the powerful accountable. But in our current president, we have someone who, again, as on the Washington Post editorial board, we have defined him, or at least his stances, as a threat to democracy. So I think, yes, the press deserves a big slap in the face for what it did during the election. But now that he's president, the press is on the job.
Well, that's a start. Jonathan, I'll let you go. A big
Thank
round
you,
of
Ali.
applause to Jonathan Capehart
Thank
first.
you.
Now, before we wrap this portion up, because the one common thread and common theme that keeps coming up is new voices, right? We need new voices, we need new ideas. But let's be honest, who here in the first day and a half has heard something that he or she hadn't heard before? Let's see, something groundbreaking, something that blew your mind, something where you couldn't resist and had to go to Twitter and immediately share it with your followers, something that where you felt, yes, this is exactly what we need at challenging times. Let me look around the room. Well, Christoph von Marsha, what have you heard that you haven't heard before?
No, it's just a style of discussion. For example, the Brexit discussion, how Charles Grant challenged, for example, the British congressman, was for me revealing. Timmermans was a very good thing. So I wouldn't say that, well, I wouldn't now say this one news, I never heard it before. That's not about that. But the style, how we debate and how we define challenges, that's, yeah, I'm satisfied with it.
So you feel that more diversity is being brought in the Brussels Forum and in this particular venue. Okay, let's rephrase it then. What have you heard that surprised you the most of all the debates that we've had up until now throughout the first day and a half? Who wants to share, their sentiment, their feelings? Something where you felt, okay, this is something that really blew my mind. Go ahead.
Hannah Shellist, Ukraine Analytica. It was yesterday comparing of the DCFTA that Ukraine has and the possibility of the same agreement for Britain from Carl Bildt. Because I just realized how many years and efforts it took for Ukraine, that it left to the Euromaidan revolution and everything. And I really started to put it to the British context and imagining what it can be, except of all other challenges that definitely were discussed about the Brexit. But comparing new agreement for the UK with the Ukrainian DCFTA, it was something challenging for the mind.
All right, can you pass on the mic to this gentleman right there?
Hi, Kevin Barron from Defense One. I still think it's this sense that the populism in the rise is some type of a bad thing that is causing a panic in this room that must be dealt with and is in no way some possibly good upheaval that could produce a future. It's been much more the former, far less of the latter. I didn't expect I think panicky is the kind of word that I keep thinking of about the attitude of this room.
All right, let's bring in one more voice to get the pulse here. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. I was surprised to hear, especially in this room, the statement yesterday that it's not a matter of poverty, but it's a matter of future expectations. And that stayed in my mind because I thought that was such a miss, that there is no way that you can talk about poverty over here and future expectations over there and not think that you're not going to get to A, without B. When there is poverty, and in all of our countries, such a critical mass of people are or are becoming that, there is no hope of future expectation. And the most dangerous thing we can do is endorse, incorporate, or be negligent to hopelessness. So I was surprised, given the intelligence, foresight, and ability in this room, that was a comment that was made and seemed to be well accepted. For me, anyone who believes that needs to spend more time not in this room, but in rooms outside of this room.
All right. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing that assessment. Now, day 2 of Brussels Forum, we still have many more sessions to go. I will keep coming back and ask you for your impressions, for your opinions, because at the end of the day, we started off this Brussels Forum with the call to end the era of complacency and call for action. This is exactly what we will keep doing. But for now, you've been very patient sitting here throughout this morning. I think it's time to get some caffeine and get reawakened and rejuvenated. I'll see you back here after the coffee break. Thank you.